For this week's exploration, we're going to be looking at Death in America, the 19th century view of death. And with this, we're going to look at it in conjunction with Emily Dickinson's poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. When we think of the 19th century, we must understand that, first of all, death is inevitable, but how we cope changes over time. In the 1800s, death was local and handled locally, usually within the family and not much further than that. However, the Civil War changed that practice, many of the practices, simply because of the number of deaths that happened over such a short length of time. If we look at infant mortality from 1900 to 2000, you can see that 165 deaths per 1,000 births. That's a little over 16% of all infant mortality. If you went to the age of 10, it would have been much higher. Also, you will look in 1900, the life expectancy was 47 years old. So that if you lived to be 50, you were beating the odds. Another thing that changed our views and practices regarding death was the large influx of immigrants between 1870 and 1910, coming from Italy, Germany, and England. Also, there were some from Russia and other places in Eastern Europe. Many of these immigrants were Roman Catholic and brought their own traditions with them to a more Protestant religious America. You can also see that there was a change in population from rural to urban over that time. If you look at 1860, right here, you will see that 25 million people lived in the rural and only 6 million lived in urban centers. If you go to 1920, you can see that the population now shifted where most of the people lived in urban centers. This also would affect how death was handled, simply because of lack of space for burials. The place of death usually took place at home or near home. Causes were accident and disease. More people died of disease than from accidents back then. Viewings were in the house, usually the living room. If the house was small, it might be the kitchen, where a table was cleared off and the body was put into place. Pictures of loved ones after death was very common. We'll look at that a little bit later. The wake, literally, is a shortening of wakening the dead. This was to ensure that the dead were really dead. It was not very rare that someone was in a coma or in some other state where vital signs were not easily determined and the person woke up. With the Civil War, embalming became far more common, as was Abraham Lincoln was embalmed to endure the 16-day trip from Washington, D.C. to his home in Springfield, Illinois. He went by train. The people along the route made the train go slow, so he absolutely needed to be preserved. In the early 1800s, there was a fear of being buried alive, taphophobia, so special coffins were made. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about it, premature burial. However, the practice of embalming really solved that fear. If you weren't dead by the time you went to the embalmers, you were by the time you left. There is a difference between a coffin and a casket. Coffins were hexagonal, sometimes with viewing windows. You can see over here this little thing where the window can be opened to view the child. Usually they were made of wood without handles and were carried on the shoulders. Caskets had handles. And were square. And after the Civil War, they started to be made of metal. The pall, and we have the pallbearer, was actually the cloth over the coffin. Today we see it mostly at military funerals when we have a flag draped over a coffin. Our funerals turned from family gatherings to community events after the Civil War. It used to be that funerals were considered private and only immediate family would attend if they were available. Many times telegraphs would be sent notifying kin of death. By the mid-1800s, funeral homes and undertakers started to develop as a profession. Cremation was rare, however. Many religions frowned on cremation, but flowers and coaches with flowers on them became far more popular. Where you were buried changed also. Most of the time it would be in a small family plot on a piece of land that you owned, since most people were rural, to what at that time was called the garden movement, where cemeteries were built on large plots of land with a good view. So there was a real change in how people were buried. The mourning period was far longer than what we normally do today. A widow for a husband was a year and a day, sometimes to life. Queen Victoria, after her husband died, wore black for the last 40 or 50 years of her life. A widower for a wife was 3 to 6 months. He was expected to remarry. Parents for a child, 6 to 12 months. A child for a parent, 6 to 12 months. For a grandparent, 6 months. For an aunt or uncle, 3 months. And it was expected that you would wear black. If you're a woman, head covered or a veil. Because death was so common, and oftentimes the person who died was so young, attempts were made to keep a remembrance of the person that died. And so the memento mori, which means remember death, was a way a person could keep the memory of the person and continue to grieve for the grieving period. There was frequently post-death photos. This is a mother holding her deceased child, about 1850 to 1860. It must have been very hard for the mother to do that. Another way, particularly before photographs became more common, was a desk mat. This has been around for thousands of years. King Tut had a death mask. And if the person was important, the mask it was made out of plaster or wax from the body immediately after death. Hair art was also extremely common, where hair was cut from the deceased person and formed into jewelry. You can see the hair inside the brooch here. Intricate wall hangings with all hair from the deceased, or mourning dolls were placed on graves of deceased children. The child's hair, actual hair, would be used on the doll. Pins, ribbons, and memorial cards were very common as well. So a mourning brooch, ribbons, many times with a picture of the deceased in it. And of course, and we still do this today, the memorial card. So let's talk about how this applies to the poem I Heard a Fly Buzz. So that's the entire poem. And so let's look at it in a little bit more detail, because this is one of Emily Dickinson's more famous poems, and one of the ones that has caused more discussion on what it actually means. So, I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storms. So what is the situation in the room? There is a tension of a waiting, a stillness between the heaves of storm, and that could be the heaves of someone breathing the last breath. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathered firm, for the last onset, when the king be witnessed in the room. So who is present? Most likely family members would be around the person dying. And death was not always fast. It could take days for a person to die. And so they had cried so much that they could not cry anymore. For the last onset when the king be witness. So who is the king? And many interpretations say that it is God or Jesus that is the king. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portions of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly. So what has a dying person done? Given away all those things that you can give away, all jewelry, anything that you want someone to have before you go. It prevents arguments later on. But then something happens. There interposed a fly. So in the process of this, a fly started buzzing around. And so this is the last stanza. With blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Well, where does the fly appear? It appears between the person dying and the light. Now, what light is this? Is it a light from a window? Is it a light at the end of the tunnel that we sometimes hear from people who have a near-death experience? And then what is the windows that fail? Is it a real window? Is it a metaphor for the eyelids closing? Now, this is a part that people debate. What is the meaning of the fly in the poem? I'll let you think on that because I don't have a single answer for you. So to summarize, in the 19th century, death was more common than now. Childhood deaths were much higher. The response to death was personal and close, usually at home, cared for at home, and buried near home. The prevalence of death was common in topic in writing. And Emily Dickinson's I Heard a Fly Buzz is an supreme example of memento mori. Remember, we must die. And here are some sources that you may use. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this.